There are two general ways that fragments get added to activities. First, they can be statically added to the activity. For example, by putting them into the activity's layout file, which is then used in a call to set content view. Alternatively, you can add fragments programmatically using the Fragment Manager. However they get added though, once they're added, Android will make a call to onCreateView. And within onCreateView, the fragment can use its own XML layout, similar to what activities do when they call setContentView. Or they can programmatically build their user interfaces. And again, however it's done, once the user interface view is built, onCreateView must return the view that's at the root of its user interface layout. And that view will eventually be given to the hosting activity and added to the hosting activity's user interface. So let's look back at the Fragment static layout application and see how it defines its layout. Here's the application again. And as you remember, there's a panel on the left showing the play titles, and there's a panel on the right showing quotes. And each of these panels is implemented by a different fragment. One is called Title Fragment, and the other is called Quote Fragment. And this application's main activity is called Quote Viewer Activity. Let's open up the Quote Viewer Activity file and see how it handles or creates its layout. Now first, you see that in the onCreate method, there's a call to set content view with the parameter value r.layout.main. So let's look in the res/layout directory for the file called main.xml. Now here it is, and let me open it up. As you can see, the entire layout is comprised of something called a linear layout. And that linear layout contains two fragments, and inside those fragment tags, there's an attribute called class. And the value of this attribute is the name of the class that implements that fragment. So in this case, one fragment is implemented by the title fragment class, and the other is implemented by the quotes fragment class. Anyway, that's enough for now. We'll talk more about layouts when we get to user interfaces. And in any event, when this XML file is read, Android will understand that it needs to create these two fragments and that it needs to install them in the Quote Viewer activity. And this will start the chain of lifecycle calls that we talked about earlier. And as I said, one of those calls will be a call to onCreateView, in which the fragment is responsible for creating its user interface layout. Let's take a look at one of those layouts, the one in Quote Fragment, to see how it creates its user interface. Now here's the Quote Fragment class, and down here is its onCreateView method. This method calls the inflate method of the layout inflator class, passing in a layout file as a parameter. And the effect of this is pretty similar to what happens in setContentView. Specifically, an XML file is read in and converted into Java objects corresponding to some user interface views. You can also add fragments to an activity without hard-coding the fragments into the activity's layout file. And to do that, while the activity is running, you have to do four things. 1, get a reference to the Fragment Manager. 2, begin a fragment transaction. 3, add a fragment to the activity. And 4, commit the fragment transaction. Now to see this in action, let's take the Fragment static layout application and change it a bit so that the fragments are added programmatically rather than being added as part of the Quote Viewer's layout file. Now here we are back in the IDE. I've created a new application called Fragment Programmatic Layout, and it's supposed to look exactly like Fragment Static Layout. The only difference is how the fragments get added to the main activity. Let's open up the Quote Viewer activity and see how it handles its layout. Now here in onCreate, there's a call to set content view with the parameter value r.layout.main. So let's look in the res/layout directory for that main.xml file. Now here it is. Let me open it up. Now as you can see, the entire layout is again a linear layout with two subviews. But instead of it being the subviews being fragments, this time the subviews are frame layouts. And a frame layout is essentially reserves some space in the user interface, and we'll fill this space in later when we add the fragments to this activity. Now let's go back to the onCreate method of quote_viewer_activity. Now we'll walk through the steps of adding the fragments into the activity. Now just like I said earlier, there are 4 steps. First, we get a reference to the fragment manager. Then we call the begin transaction method on the fragment manager. And that returns a fragment transaction. Next, we call the add method of the fragment transaction, passing in an ID for the frame layout and passing in the fragment that view will hold. And we'll do that for both the title fragment and for the quote fragment. And finally, we'll call the commit method on the fragment transaction. Now let's run the code and make sure that we haven't goofed anything up. And here's the fragment programmatic layout application running on an emulated tablet. And it seems to operate as promised. So now we know how to add fragments to an activity programmatically. But in our example, it didn't really make that much difference in the sense that even though we added the fragments programmatically, the layout itself was static. There are always exactly 2 panels, and that never changes. Now, one of the nice things about being able to add fragments on the fly, however, is that it allows you to dynamically change the user interface while the program is running. And if you do this right, it allows you to make good use of your precious screen space. So let's take a look at a simple example that gives you a little flavor of this dynamic user interfaces. I'll launch an application called Fragment Dynamic Layout, which again is similar to the previous examples, but sometimes it will show a single fragment and sometimes it will show multiple fragments. So here the application, we've just started it up and it's showing a single fragment. It's showing the title fragment and nothing else. And in fact, you can see here that I've changed the title of Hamlet to make it a little bit longer. And you can see that it takes up much more of the screen space than before. And in addition, if I click on that title, you can see that the item is indeed taking up the entire screen horizontally. Now that I've finished clicking on the title, though, you can see the familiar quote from Hamlet. And at this point, the application is displaying 2 fragments. If I now hit the back button, you see that we've gone back to having just a single fragment. So let's take a look at the source code. Now here I am back in the IDE, and I'll open up the Fragment Dynamic Layout application, and we'll take a look at the quote viewer activity file. Now first, here's the call to set content view, passing in the main.xml file. And this is pretty similar to what we saw before. Next, we'll start the process of adding a fragment to this activity. This time, however, we'll only add the title fragment. In fact, we'll only ever add the quote fragment if the user indeed clicks on a title. Now, supposing the user does click on the title, the onListSelection method will then be called. Now let's take a look at that method. First, we'll test to see if the quote fragment has already been added to the layout. And if it hasn't, then we'll add it now by starting another fragment transaction. So 2 things are new here. First, we're going to add this transaction to the task backstack. And that way, when the user hits the back button, we'll go back to the 1 fragment layout that we had before it was added. And we have to do this because by default, fragment changes are not tracked by the backstack. The second new thing is that at the end, I've added a call to fragment manager.execute pending transactions. And this forces the transaction to be executed immediately rather than at some later time when the system finds it convenient to do so. And again, I have to do this because otherwise Android might take, God knows how long before it actually updates the display. Now, if you remember back to our lesson on the activity class, I talked about how activities can handle configuration changes manually using methods such as onRetain non-configuration instance and getLast non-configuration instance. And at that time, I mentioned that those methods were deprecated in favor of other methods in the Fragment class. So let's talk about those methods now. Now, if you're using a fragment and the device's configuration changes, then Android by default will kill the hosting activity and recreate it, just like we talked about before. However, if you call the setRetainInstance method on the fragment, passing in the value true as a parameter, then when configuration changes occur, Android will kill the activity but not destroy the fragments that it's hosting. Instead, it will save that fragment state and it will detach the fragment from the activity. And in addition, it won't destroy that fragment, and so it won't recreate it later when the hosting activity is recreated. And as a result, the fragment will not receive calls to its onDestroy method nor to its onCreate method. Let's take a look at another example application that demonstrates this behavior. This application is called Fragment Static Config Layout, and its functionality is the same as the previous examples. The difference here, though, is that I've added some code to handle configuration changes. Now, when the device is in landscape mode, the layout is basically what we've seen so far. Both fragments use a large font of size 32 SP or scale-independent pixels. The title fragment takes about 1/3 of the horizontal space, while the quote fragment takes the remaining 2/3 of the space. And if a title is too long to fit on a single line in the title fragment, that text will simply wrap around to a second line. When the device is in portrait mode, however, the layout changes a bit. Both fragments use a smaller 24 SP font, and the title fragment takes up only 1/4 of the horizontal space, while the quote fragment takes up the remaining 3/4 of the space. And if a title is too long to fit on a single line in the title fragment, then that title will still be limited to a single line, and we'll just replace some of the text with ellipses. Let's see that application in action. I'll start the application with the device in landscape mode. I'll select one of the titles to show a quote, and as I said, the title fragment and quote fragment will use larger fonts. They're dividing up the screen in a roughly 1/4 to 3/4 ratio, and in the title fragment, it's allowing the title of Hamlet to spill over onto a second line. Now let's rotate the device. Now, one thing that you notice is that even though Android has killed and restarted the quote viewer activity, the title that I'd previously checked is still checked. And that's because I made sure to call setRetainInstance true in both fragments. So information, for example, information about which item was checked, has been retained. Now we'll see how that's done in just a second. You'll also notice that now that we're in portrait mode, the layout has changed. In fact, the fonts are smaller now, and instead of that Hamlet title spanning 2 lines, the end of the title has been replaced with ellipses. So let's go see how this works in the code. Now here I've opened the Fragment Static Config Layout application in the IDE. Next, I'll open up the title fragment.java file. And as you can see, this code is mostly the same as what we saw in the other example applications, but there are at least 2 differences. Let's look at those. The first difference is in the onCreate method. I've added a call to setRetainInstance true. And again, this means that when configuration changes occur, Android will not kill this fragment. The second difference is in the onActivityCreated method. And right here at the end, I've added some code that checks to see whether mCurrentIndex is not equal to -1. And if that's true, it means that the user has previously selected a title, and so this call to onActivityCreated is probably occurring because of a configuration change. So in this case, we want to make sure that that title remains checked now. And I made similar changes to the quote fragment class as well. So that's all for our discussion of the fragment class. Please join me next time when we'll cover Android user interfaces. Thanks.